Homeless woman begs at a millionaire's mansion. He freezes when he realizes she's his first love. Before going into the video, please leave us a like and a subscribe so we have the motivation to make the next videos. The wind howled through the empty streets, a bitter reminder that winter held the city in an unforgiving grip. Elena Monroe pulled her tattered coat tighter around her frail frame, but it was useless against the biting cold that gnawed at her bones. Beside her, her 6-year-old daughter, Mia, shivered violently, her small fingers clutching at Elena's sleeve as they trudged forward through the snow-covered sidewalks of Chicago. The city had been their home once, a place of dreams and ambition, but now it was nothing more than a battlefield where survival was a nightly war. Mommy, I'm cold, Mia whimpered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Elena's heart clenched painfully at the sound. She had no warmth to give her daughter, no shelter to offer, no promise that things would get better. It had been hours since they were turned away from the overcrowded shelter downtown. Every door they had knocked on since had either stayed shut or been slammed in their faces. Some people peered through their curtains, their eyes shadowed with pity, or worse, indifference, but no one had been willing to help. Elena knelt, brushing a stray curl from Mia's pale face. I know, sweetheart. Just hold on a little longer, okay? Her voice cracked, betraying the exhaustion and hopelessness she tried so desperately to hide. A mother was supposed to be strong, but how much strength did she have left? Mia nodded, trusting, always trusting, something that made Elena's guilt cut deeper than the cold. She had promised her daughter a better life, one where she would never have to beg, never have to sleep on frozen pavement, never have to wonder if they would make it through the night. And yet here they were, wandering the streets with nowhere left to go. Her legs burned from hours of walking, her fingers stiff from the frost, her stomach twisted with the gnawing ache of hunger. But it was the weight of regret that burdened her the most. She had made mistakes, mistakes that had led her here, to this moment, where her child had to suffer because of her choices. If she had done things differently, if she had stayed instead of running all those years ago, would life have been kinder? But it was too late for what-ifs and regrets. Then, through the thick haze of falling snow, she saw it, a mansion standing like a beacon in the storm. Its wrought iron gates loomed tall, wrapped in frost and shadow, but beyond them, golden light poured from its massive windows, casting a warm glow onto the icy driveway. The house looked like something out of a dream, too perfect, too distant, a world away from the one she and Mia had been forced to live in. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Whoever lived inside had wealth, wealth beyond what she could even comprehend, a world of silk curtains and grand chandeliers, of warmth and security, of lives untouched by desperation and hunger. A place where no one would ever have to beg for shelter. She almost turned away, convinced that people like that wouldn't care about someone like her. But Mia's whimper pulled her back. Her daughter needed warmth, needed safety, needed something more than the cruel indifference the world had shown them tonight. This is it, baby, Elena whispered, though her voice was thick with hesitation. Just one more try. She pushed open the gate, its iron bars cold against her numb fingers, and guided Mia through the snow-covered driveway. With each step, her heart pounded louder. What if they were turned away again? What if this was just another locked door, another cruel rejection? She reached the grand double doors, hesitating only for a second before raising a trembling fist and knocking firmly. The sound echoed into the stillness of the night, swallowed quickly by the howling wind. Seconds stretched into eternity. Just as she was about to lose hope, the door creaked open, and then she froze. Standing in the warm glow of the mansion's entrance, wearing a crisp black suit and a look of stunned disbelief, was Lucas Calloway. The past crashed into her like a tidal wave, stealing the breath from her lungs. She hadn't seen him in nearly 7 years. Lucas, the man she had once loved more than anything, the man she had walked away from without a word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lucas's piercing blue eyes, still just as intense as she remembered, widened in shock. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something else, something unreadable. Elena, he whispered, his voice barely above the wind. Elena's hands trembled at her sides. How was this happening? Of all the doors in this city, Of all the homes she could have stumbled upon tonight, why did it have to be his? Before she could speak, Mia tugged on her sleeve, her tiny voice breaking the tension. Mommy, I'm so tired. Lucas's gaze shifted to the small girl clinging to Elena's side. Something in his expression changed. A flicker of confusion, of recognition, of something deeper. His brows furrowed, his mouth slightly parted, as if he had just seen a ghost. Elena swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away. She couldn't let this happen. Not now, not here. But before she could move, Lucas stepped aside, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing in his eyes. Come in. And as Elena stepped across the threshold, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. The door swung open wider, allowing warm golden light to spill onto the icy steps where Elena Monroe and her daughter Mia stood trembling. Inside, the grand mansion stretched before her, its polished marble floors reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers above. The contrast between the warmth inside and the bitter cold outside was so stark, so overwhelming, that for a moment she felt dizzy, as if she had crossed into another world, one she no longer belonged to. Yet it wasn't the lavish interior that made her knees weak. It was him, Lucas Calloway. His name was a whisper in her mind, an echo of a past that had long since shattered. He stood frozen in the doorway, his sharp blue eyes locked onto her, with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through the years, through the layers of hardship and shame, through the hunger and desperation etched into her bones. Elena, he breathed again, this time louder, his voice carrying a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else, something that made her stomach twist painfully. She couldn't breathe. The weight of his gaze was suffocating, crushing her beneath a tidal wave of memories she had spent years trying to bury. She saw him as he had been back then, the boy she had loved, the boy she had left. She had memorized every detail of him once, the way his laugh had once been the most beautiful sound in the world, the way he used to pull her close as if he never wanted to let go. But this Lucas was different. The warmth in his face was gone, replaced by an unreadable mask of power and distance. He looked harder, sharper, the kind of man who had spent years building walls so high that nothing could reach him. And yet, in this moment, those walls were crumbling. What are you doing here? His voice was softer now, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether to believe what he was seeing. Elena opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She had imagined this moment before, not like this, never like this. But in the quiet of the nights when loneliness wrapped around her like a second skin, she had wondered what she would say if she ever saw him again. But now that she stood before him, she realized there was nothing she could say that would undo the past. She had nothing left to give except the truth. We needed shelter, she finally whispered, lowering her eyes to avoid the way his piercing gaze made her feel like a ghost of the girl she had once been. We've been out in the cold for hours, and I didn't know this was your house. A sharp breath left Lucas's lips, and she swore she saw something flicker in his expression, something like pain. His gaze flickered to Mia. Elena knew the moment he really saw her, the moment he saw his own reflection staring back at him. Mia's wide blue eyes, his blue eyes, blinked up at him, curious and uncertain. Elena felt the air shift, a storm brewing in the space between them. Lucas's entire body stiffened, his jaw clenching so tightly she thought he might shatter from the force of it. His breath hitched, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. Elena, he said her name again, but this time it was different. This time it was a question, a demand, a plea. Elena gripped Mia's small fingers tighter, instinctively shielding her child as if she could somehow stop the inevitable from crashing down around them. Lucas's gaze flickered back and forth between Elena and Mia, his mind racing, connecting dots, fitting together pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed until this moment. Mia yawned sleepily, rubbing her tiny fists against her eyes before looking up at him again. Mommy, who's that? The words cut through the silence like a knife. Lucas inhaled sharply. Elena felt her heart splinter in her chest. She had to say something, had to explain. But how? How did she begin to tell him that the little girl standing before him was his, that she had been carrying his child when she walked away, that for 6 years he had unknowingly been a father? But before she could even think of a response, Lucas moved. "Come in," he said suddenly, stepping aside, his voice rough, strained, as if he barely trusted himself to speak. Elena hesitated. She had nowhere else to go, but stepping into this house, into his world again, felt like stepping onto a battlefield she wasn't prepared to fight on. Lucas's eyes darkened. "You can't stay out there." He wasn't wrong. The cold was brutal, and Mia was exhausted. Slowly, reluctantly, Elena stepped inside. The warmth hit her instantly, wrapping around her like a cruel reminder of all the comfort she had lost over the years. She swallowed the lump in her throat and focused on guiding Mia further into the house, keeping her steps measured, controlled, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. Lucas closed the door behind them with a quiet click. For a moment, the silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words and buried emotions. Elena didn't dare look at him. She could feel the weight of his stare, the tension humming between them like a wire pulled too tight. Finally, Lucas cleared his throat. "Sit!" Elena hesitated but complied, sinking onto the plush couch near the fireplace. Mia curled up beside her immediately, drawn to the warmth, her small body pressing against Elena's side. Lucas didn't sit. He just stood there watching them, his expression unreadable. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Elena," he started, his voice low, strained. "Is she—" Elena closed her eyes for a brief second, willing herself to find the strength to say what needed to be said. "Yes." The word fell between them, heavy, irreversible. Lucas inhaled sharply, turning away as if the truth had physically struck him. He exhaled a slow, measured breath before facing her again. "You never told me." There was no accusation in his voice, just raw, quiet devastation. Elena's throat tightened. I thought it was better this way." Lucas's eyes darkened, a storm raging behind them now. "Better?" His voice was still calm, but there was something dangerous beneath the surface, something barely restrained. "Better for who, Elena? For me? For you? Because it sure as hell wasn't better for her." He glanced at Mia, at his daughter, and something flickered in his expression. Elena flinched. There was nothing she could say that would make this easier. Lucas turned away, running a hand through his hair, letting out a breath that sounded far too much like a broken man trying to hold himself together. For 6 years, he had lived his life believing he had moved on. For 6 years, he had built his empire, thrown himself into work, convinced himself that love was just a distraction. And now, in a single night, everything had changed. "Elena," he said finally, quieter now, "why did you come here?" Elena swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I didn't know this was your house." His gaze flickered toward her, skeptical. "But you did come here," he murmured, his voice softer now, less sharp. "And now that you're here, what do you want?" Elena's breath hitched. What did she want? She wanted a home for Mia. She wanted safety. She wanted warmth. She wanted forgiveness. But most of all, she wanted a second chance. She didn't know if Lucas would give her one. But as she watched him look at Mia, really look at her, as if seeing his own heart reflected in those innocent blue eyes, she realized something. No matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The warmth of the fire crackled in the background, casting flickering golden light against the high ceilings of Lucas Calloway's grand mansion. The contrast between the luxurious surroundings and the two shivering figures who had just stepped inside was staggering, like a cruel joke played by fate. Elena Monroe sat stiffly on the edge of the plush couch, clutching her daughter Mia close, still trying to process the impossible reality of where she was. Her breath was shaky, her body aching from exhaustion, and her mind was a battlefield of regret and fear. She shouldn't be here. Not in his home. Not after everything. Lucas stood by the fireplace, his face unreadable, his arms crossed tightly as though trying to hold himself together. The room was thick with tension, as if the past had seeped through the walls and now loomed over them, demanding to be acknowledged. Mia, oblivious to the storm brewing between the adults, curled up against Elena's side, her small fingers fisting into her mother's worn coat. She had always been too good, too patient, too trusting. But tonight, her exhaustion was winning. Elena smoothed a hand over her daughter's curls, pressing a kiss to her forehead, whispering, "Rest, baby." Mia mumbled something incoherent before her small body went slack against her mother's, sinking into sleep. Lucas's voice cut through the silence. "She's mine." Elena flinched. There was no hesitation in his words, no doubt, just cold, heavy certainty. She slowly lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes, the same piercing blue eyes Mia had inherited. And for the first time since stepping through that door, she had no choice but to face the truth head on. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's yours." Lucas let out a slow, controlled breath, as if trying to stop himself from breaking apart. He turned slightly, his gaze falling on Mia, taking in every tiny detail. The curve of her nose, the soft golden curls framing her small face, the way her lips parted slightly as she slept. Something in his expression shifted. Elena saw it, the moment the reality of 6 lost years hit him. The realization that while he had been building his empire, his daughter had been out there growing up without him. And it was her fault. "Elena," he said, his voice lower now, strained with something she couldn't quite name. "You left. You disappeared. You let me believe you never wanted me again." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And now, after all this time, you show up at my house in the middle of the night, and I find out I have a daughter I never even knew existed?" Elena clenched her fists, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I didn't do it to hurt you, Lucas." His laugh was hollow. "Didn't you?" A lump formed in her throat. "No," she whispered. I I was scared." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Of me?" "No," she admitted. "Of being a burden to you." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. She saw the flash of confusion in his eyes, the way his brows furrowed slightly, his lips parting as if he couldn't comprehend what she had just said. Elena took a shaky breath, her fingers absent-mindedly running through Mia's curls as she finally let the memories in. Memories she had spent so many years trying to bury. 6 years ago, they had been young, too young, college sweethearts, dreamers, lovers. Lucas had been unstoppable, destined for greatness. The world had been his for the taking. And Elena, she had been lost. She had always known their lives were moving in different directions. He had plans, big ones. A high-paying job, a future that would take him places she had only seen in magazines. And she had nothing. No career lined up, no prospects, just a degree and a heart full of uncertainty. She had tried to keep up with him, to fit into the picture of success he was painting, but deep down she had felt like an imposter. And then she found out she was pregnant. The moment she saw the 2 pink lines on the test, her world crumbled. How could she tell him? How could she ruin everything he had worked so hard for? So she had done the only thing she thought she could do. She had left. She had packed her things in the middle of the night, left behind nothing but a note that wasn't nearly enough to explain the storm raging inside her. She had convinced herself that Lucas was better off without her, better off not knowing, better off chasing the future he deserved, not being tied down by a woman who had nothing to offer but a baby she wasn't even sure she could take care of. And so, she disappeared. At first, she thought she had done the right thing, but then reality hit. The months that followed were hell. She was alone, broke, and terrified. She had spent her pregnancy barely scraping by, living off whatever scraps she could find. She worked endless shifts at a diner, her feet aching, her back sore, all while hiding her growing belly beneath oversized sweaters. She had given birth in a hospital with no one waiting in the hallway, no hand to hold, just cold, sterile walls and the overwhelming fear of how she was supposed to do this alone. She had spent nights holding Mia, rocking her to sleep in the tiny one-room apartment she could barely afford, whispering apologies into the silence. And now, 6 years later, here she was, right back where she started, in front of Lucas, the man she had run from, the man whose child she had kept secret. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. Lucas stared at her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her chest ache, something raw, something broken. "Protecting me?" he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "By taking away my daughter?" Elena swallowed. "By making sure you didn't have to give up everything for me." Lucas took a slow step forward. His gaze never wavered. You think I would have cared about any of that? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Lucas let out a bitter laugh. You don't get to decide that for me, Elena. Her breath hitched. I know. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Lucas turned away, running a hand over his face, as if trying to collect the pieces of himself that had shattered with every word she had spoken. He exhaled. Then finally, he looked at Mia again, and everything changed. He walked closer, kneeling in front of the sleeping child. Elena tensed but didn't stop him. Lucas hesitated, as if afraid that if he reached out, she would disappear. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted a hand and brushed a strand of golden hair from Mia's face. The smallest smile ghosted across her lips in her sleep, as if, even in dreams, she could feel him there. Lucas let out a shaky breath, and in that moment, Elena saw it. The walls around his heart cracked, and in their place, something else took root. Something undeniable, something that would change everything. The silence in the grand mansion stretched unbearably, thick with the weight of years lost, of truths unspoken, of choices that could never be undone. Lucas Calloway knelt before the small figure sleeping on the couch, his fingers hovering just inches away from a golden curl that had fallen across her tiny face. His daughter. The words echoed in his mind over and over, crashing into him like relentless waves, stealing the breath from his lungs. He had a daughter. 6 years. 6 years of nothing. 6 years of believing Elena had simply walked away because she didn't love him anymore, because he hadn't been enough. 6 years of silence, of bearing the heartbreak beneath work and power, of convincing himself that love was just a foolish distraction. But she had been out there, his child, and he had missed everything. Her first breath, her first steps, her first words. A sharp ache spread through his chest, a different kind of pain than he had ever known. It wasn't just the anger, the betrayal of knowing Elena had made the choice for him. It wasn't even just the disbelief of seeing proof of his own bloodline lying before him in the form of a little girl with the same blue eyes. It was the grief of time stolen from him. It was the soul-crushing knowledge that he could never get those years back. Elena, he finally spoke, his voice hoarse, the name heavy on his tongue. Why? Elena sat on the couch, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, as if bracing for impact. Her tired brown eyes glistened under the warm light, but she didn't look away. She owed him this. I told you, she whispered, barely audible. I thought it was better this way. Lucas let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Better for who? For me? Or for you? Elena flinched, but she didn't defend herself. Because deep down, she knew he was right. For years, she had told herself she was protecting him, that she was giving him the future he deserved, that he would have been trapped with her, that he would have grown resentful, that he would have walked away eventually anyway. But looking at him now, she saw what she hadn't allowed herself to before. He had never been the kind of man to run. No, she had been the coward. The truth settled in her stomach like a stone, suffocating and inescapable. Lucas exhaled sharply, his fingers pressing against his temples as if trying to stop himself from unraveling completely. Do you have any idea what you took from me? His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the storm raging beneath the surface. Elena's throat burned. I do now. His head snapped up. Now? His laugh was sharp, bitter. Now that you're standing in my house with nowhere else to go. The words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. If tonight hadn't happened, if she hadn't been forced to knock on his door out of sheer desperation, would she have ever told him? Would she have let him go his whole life without knowing he had a daughter? Her lips trembled. I was scared. Lucas scoffed, shaking his head. You were scared. He repeated the words slowly, as if testing them on his tongue, as if they tasted like poison. And what about me, Elena? Do you even know what it was like for me after you left? I spent months searching for you. Months wondering what the hell happened. Months thinking I meant nothing to you. Elena squeezed her eyes shut. She knew. She had known even then that he would have looked for her, that he would have fought for her, and she had let him believe he wasn't worth fighting for. Tears burned in her eyes. I never stopped loving you. The words tumbled from her lips before she could stop them. Lucas stilled. The fire crackled in the silence, filling the space between them with warmth. But Elena had never felt colder, because it didn't matter anymore. She could love him with every shattered piece of her soul, but that wouldn't change the fact that she had stolen 6 years of his daughter's life from him. Lucas let out a slow, heavy breath, dragging a hand through his dark hair. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since she had stepped into his home, the anger in his eyes faded just enough for something else to take its place. Hurt, loss, something that looked terrifyingly close to longing. Elena, he said again, softer this time. You should have told me. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. I know. Lucas exhaled, his gaze flickering back to Mia's sleeping form, the rise and fall of her small chest, the peaceful expression on her face, completely unaware of the war raging between the two people who had brought her into this world. Elena knew what he was thinking. He had lost 6 years, but he wouldn't lose another second. When he looked back at her, his eyes were different. Still stormy, still guarded, but underneath it all, there was something solid, unwavering. I want to know her, he said. I wanted to be in her life. A tear slipped down Elena's cheek. She doesn't know about you. Lucas's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Then we start there. He stood, pacing the floor, hands braced on his hips, as if grounding himself for what came next. Elena wiped at her face, watching him carefully. Lucas, he turned to her sharply, cutting her off. I'm not asking. She's mine, and I will be in her life. The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Not that she had any fight left in her. She nodded, her fingers tightening around the fabric of Mia's coat. Lucas let out a breath, raking a hand through his hair once more before dropping his gaze back to the child sleeping soundly on the couch. His child. He crouched down again, just watching her, memorizing her, taking in every tiny detail. 6 years late, Elena couldn't look away. There was something in his expression, something so painfully raw and unguarded that she felt it like a dagger to her chest. She had been so afraid that she had ruined his life. But as she watched him reach out, brushing the back of his knuckles gently against Mia's tiny hand, she realized the truth was much worse. She hadn't ruined his life. She had stolen something irreplaceable from it, and she would spend the rest of hers trying to make it right. If you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you for sticking with Elena's story. Her journey is one of pain, regret, but also redemption and hope. Do you think Lucas should forgive her, or should he make her fight for it? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to hear what happens next, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because the story is far from over. And trust me, the next chapter will change everything. The weight of the truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as Lucas Calloway remained crouched in front of Mia's sleeping form. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the shadows beneath his eyes. The exhaustion, the disbelief, and the undeniable ache of 6 years lost. He couldn't stop staring at her. His daughter. It didn't matter how many times the words echoed in his mind. They still didn't feel real. How could they? For years he had believed he was alone. He had buried himself in work, convinced himself that love was fleeting, that people always left in the end. He had trained himself to be ruthless, to build an empire so impenetrable that no one would ever have the power to hurt him again. But here she was, a little girl with golden curls and wide blue eyes, a child who had lived an entire life without him. And now he would never get that time back. The realization struck him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. 6 birthdays, 6 Christmas mornings. 6 years of scraped knees and bedtime stories and tiny fingers reaching for comfort. All of them stolen from him. And the worst part? She didn't even know who he was. The lump in Lucas's throat tightened as he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe. He had spent so many years building walls, protecting himself from the past, from pain. But now the past had walked right through his front door, shivering from the cold, looking at him with the same brown eyes that had once held his entire world. Elena. He tore his gaze away from Mia to look at her, sitting stiffly on the couch, her hands tangled in the frayed fabric of her coat. She was exhausted. He could see it in the hollow of her cheeks, the bruises beneath her eyes. But more than that, he saw the guilt. She knew exactly what she had taken from him. Lucas swallowed back the emotions clawing at his throat and pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow, deliberate. Elena's fingers twitched slightly, but she didn't move, didn't run. Good, because this time he wasn't letting her. His voice was calm when he spoke, but there was steel beneath it. When were you going to tell me? Elena blinked, looking up at him as if she had expected a different question. Lucas tilted his head, eyes narrowing. If you hadn't ended up on my doorstep tonight, would you have ever told me? The way her lips parted, the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, it was answer enough. Lucas let out a humorless laugh, turning away, his hands bracing on the back of the armchair as he exhaled sharply. I thought about it, Elena finally whispered. Lucas's grip tightened. He hated that answer. She thought about it? She thought about telling him that he had a daughter? Why didn't you? Elena hesitated, rubbing her hands over her arms as if she could scrub away the weight of the past. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he barely heard it. Because I didn't think you'd want her. Silence. The kind that crushed, that suffocated. Lucas turned sharply, his blue eyes flashing with something dangerous. Are you serious? Elena flinched. Lucas. No, he cut her off, stepping forward. You thought I wouldn't want her? His voice was lower now, thick with something he couldn't name. You think I'm the kind of man who would walk away from his own child? No, Elena whispered, shaking her head quickly. That's not what I meant. Lucas scoffed. Then tell me what you meant, Elena, because from where I'm standing, it sounds a hell of a lot like you never even gave me a chance. Tears welled in her eyes, her breath shuddering as she pressed her hands against her face. I was scared, okay? I didn't know what to do. I was pregnant. I had nothing, and I convinced myself that if I told you, you'd feel trapped, that you'd hate me. Lucas let out a sharp breath, running a hand over his jaw. He was trying to stay calm, but it was impossible when every word out of her mouth made his chest ache more. Hate you? His voice was hoarse, raw. Elena, do you know how much I loved you? Her breath hitched. Lucas stepped closer, his voice softer now, but no less intense. I spent months looking for you. I didn't care about anything else. Not my bum, not my future. Just you. His throat bobbed, the emotions swirling inside him nearly unbearable. And you left me thinking I wasn't enough. A single tear slipped down Elena's cheek. I was never going to leave, Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. I would have given up everything for you. For her. Elena squeezed her eyes shut. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know that now. Lucas clenched his jaw, looking away, his hands curled into fists at his sides. The past couldn't be undone. He couldn't go back and fix it, but he could change the future. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair before stepping back, his shoulders tense. I don't care why you did it, he said finally, his voice steady now, controlled. I don't care about the excuses. He turned to her, his blue eyes unreadable. What I care about is my daughter. Elena inhaled sharply. I want to be in her life, Lucas said. I don't care what it takes. I don't care what I have to do, but I will not let you take her from me again. Elena's lips trembled. I wouldn't. Lucas searched her face as if trying to find a reason to believe her. Slowly he nodded. Then we start now. He turned to Mia again, the little girl who had no idea how much her world was about to change. His world. Lucas knelt beside the couch, his heart pounding as he reached out, gently brushing his knuckles against her tiny fingers. Mia stirred slightly, her lips parting with a soft yawn before her eyelashes fluttered open. For a second she was groggy, blinking up at him in sleepy confusion. Lucas swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Then Mia smiled, a small, sleepy smile. Hi, she murmured softly. Lucas's breath caught in his chest. Hi, he whispered back. Mia tilted her head, rubbing her eyes. Are you my mommy's friend? Lucas's lips parted, his heart splintering in his chest. Elena let out a soft, broken noise, and Lucas didn't have to look at her to know she was crying. He had missed so much, but he wouldn't miss another second. Lucas forced a smile, his voice unsteady. Yeah, he murmured. I guess you could say that. Mia blinked, studying him with innocent curiosity. You have blue eyes, she said simply. Lucas let out a breathless laugh. So do you. Mia grinned, tucking her tiny fingers into his. Lucas didn't move. Couldn't, because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the pain, not even the anger. Just her, just his daughter. And for the first time in 6 years, Lucas felt something settle inside him. Hope, a second chance. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. The morning sun streamed through the grand windows of Lucas Calloway's mansion, casting golden hues across the living room, where Elena Monroe sat at the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly together, as if trying to hold herself together. Last night had changed everything. Everything. She had spent years believing she was making the right choice, convincing herself that keeping Mia from Lucas was an act of love, a sacrifice to protect him from a burden he never asked for. But the way he had looked at their daughter, the raw pain in his eyes, the tremble in his voice as he whispered hi to her for the first time, it shattered every illusion she had ever built. She had stolen something precious from him, something he could never get back. And now she didn't know what happened next. Lucas sat across from her, his hands resting on his knees, his face unreadable as he studied Mia, his daughter. Even now, after a sleepless night filled with words they couldn't take back, he hadn't moved from her side. Elena watched him watch her, the way his fingers twitched every time Mia stirred in her sleep, the way his jaw clenched as if he was still trying to process it all, the way his breath hitched every time she murmured something in her dreams, as if he couldn't believe she was real, as if he was terrified she would disappear. A lump formed in Elena's throat. She had done that to him. She had turned him into this man who sat here now, watching his child like a starving man who had just been given a meal he wasn't sure he was allowed to eat, like he was afraid to reach out in case of the universe took her away again. She had broken him, and she didn't know if she could ever fix it. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words, unhealed wounds, and the kind of silence that was louder than any scream. Finally, Lucas exhaled. He leaned back, running a hand over his face before turning to her, his piercing blue eyes filled with emotions she couldn't even begin to name. Elena, he said, his voice rough, like he had spent the whole night trying not to fall apart. She swallowed. Yeah? Lucas studied her for a moment before speaking again. I'm not letting you take her away from me. The words weren't angry, weren't accusatory. They were a vow, a quiet, unwavering promise. Elena's breath caught. I wasn't going to. Lucas nodded slowly, as if processing that, as if trying to believe it. And then, for the first time since she had stepped into this house, he asked the question that had been burning in his chest since the moment he saw Mia. Elena, what happened to you? Her stomach twisted. What? Lucas leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes locked onto hers, seeing past the guilt, past the fear, past the woman she had become. I need to know, he said quietly. I need to know what you went through. Elena's chest tightened. She had spent so many years trying to forget, trying to erase the nights spent sleeping in a one-room apartment that smelled like mildew, rocking a newborn baby to sleep while ignoring the hunger clawing at her ribs, trying to forget the loneliness, the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering if she had made a mistake. The mornings she had woken up with Mia's tiny fingers clutching her shirt, her wide blue eyes staring up at her with a trust she didn't deserve. She had fought to survive. She had fought for Mia, but it had never been easy. Elena looked away. It doesn't matter. Lucas's jaw tensed. It matters to me. Her fingers clenched in her lap. She could still feel it. The exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness, the fear that had been her constant companion for years. The days when she had scraped together just enough money for a box of baby formula. The nights when she had gone without food so Mia wouldn't have to. The moments when she had stared at her reflection in the mirror and wondered if she had made the worst mistake of her life. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. I was alone, Lucas. She didn't look at Ian, couldn't look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on her hands, on the way her fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater as if she could hold herself together with sheer force of will. I had nothing, no money, no family, no safety net. She exhaled shakily. And I was pregnant. Lucas didn't speak, didn't move. He just sat there listening, his fingers curling into fists on his knees. Elena swallowed hard. I worked at a diner until my feet bled. I slept in apartments I could barely afford, terrified that any night I'd get kicked out with nowhere to go. Her voice broke. I was scared all the time. I didn't know if I was going to make it. I didn't know if I was enough. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. I thought I was doing the right thing, she whispered. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was make a choice that wasn't mine to make. She finally looked at him. And when she did, her heart cracked all over again. Because Lucas's eyes weren't just filled with anger. They were filled with grief. Grief for the woman he had loved. Grief for the years they had lost. Grief for every moment he should have been there. For every struggle she had faced alone. Elena, he said, his voice thick, rough. Why didn't you tell me? She swallowed back another sob. Because I was afraid you would come find me. Lucas frowned. You didn't want me to find you? No, she whispered. I didn't want you to see me like that. She didn't want him to see the girl who had lost everything, who had been so tired, so hopeless, so fragile. Lucas let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room. Finally, Lucas sighed. Then he did something she didn't expect. He reached forward, his fingers grazing over the back of her hand, warm and steady and real. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Lucas's voice was quiet when he spoke. You're not alone anymore. A sob rose in her throat. She shook her head. Lucas? He squeezed her hand, firm, reassuring. You're not alone anymore, he repeated. And this time she believed him. And the days that followed were filled with a fragile, tentative peace, the kind of peace that could shatter with the wrong word, the wrong look, the wrong memory creeping in at the wrong time. Lucas Calloway was a man of control, a man who had spent years ensuring that every aspect of his life was carefully curated, calculated, and unshakable. But nothing about this situation was controlled. Nothing about fatherhood was something he had prepared for. And yet, here he was, waking up every morning to the soft sound of a little girl's laughter drifting through his home. A little girl who carried his blood, his name, his eyes, and yet didn't even know him. The first time he watched Mia eat breakfast at his kitchen table, his chest ached in a way he didn't know was possible. It was such a simple thing, a child sitting in a chair, kicking her feet, eating a plate of pancakes. But it was a moment he should have had years ago. It was a moment he had missed. Elena sat across from her, quiet, cautious. She watched Mia the way a mother who had learned to live on edge did, always ready, always waiting for something to go wrong. Lucas recognized that look, because he felt it too. For days they tiptoed around each other, around their wounds, their regrets, their anger, their hope. Every interaction was laced with a tension neither of them spoke aloud. Because the truth was, neither of them knew how to do this. Lucas had built empires, had made decisions that affected thousands of people, had sat in boardrooms and dominated negotiations with men twice his age. But sitting across from a child, his child, and not knowing how to start, how to reach out, how to be a father, that was a battle he had never prepared for. He wasn't sure how to cross that invisible line between stranger and parent, between regret and redemption. Until one night when everything changed. It had been a long day. Lucas had spent the afternoon in meetings, trying to act like his world hadn't completely shifted beneath him, trying to pretend that his mind wasn't filled with thoughts of a little girl who should have known his name long before now. By the time he arrived home, the mansion was quiet, too quiet. He expected to find Elena in the living room, maybe reading, maybe avoiding him like she had been for the past few days. Instead, he heard muffled sobs. His entire body froze. The sound was soft, small, but it sent a bolt of alarm straight through him. He followed the noise down the hall, stopping outside the slightly open door of the guest bedroom. And what he saw nearly stole the breath from his lungs. Mia sat curled up on the bed, tiny shoulders shaking, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. And Elena was holding her, rocking her gently, whispering soft, soothing words into her hair. Lucas's chest tightened painfully, because he had no idea why his daughter was crying. And he should have. He should have known what made her satiated, what made her scared, what made her need comfort. Instead, he stood there, a stranger in his own child's life, watching as another piece of the time he had lost slipped through his fingers. Something inside him cracked. Before he could second-guess himself, he stepped inside. Elena's head snapped up, surprise flashing across her tear-streaked face. But she didn't stop him. She just watched, waiting, testing him, maybe. Mia hiccuped, wiping at her damp cheeks with tiny fists. Lucas knelt beside the bed. He had never knelt for anyone. Not in business, not in life, but for his daughter, for the little girl who didn't even know what it meant to have a father. He would kneel 1,000 times. Mia sniffled, glancing at him hesitantly. Lucas hesitated too, his fingers flexing at his sides. "I heard you crying," he said softly, his voice rough, unsure. "What's wrong?" Mia hesitated. For a moment, Lucas thought she wouldn't answer. But then she whispered, "I had a bad dream." Lucas let out a slow breath. He could deal with nightmares. He had lived with his own for years. "What was it about?" he asked gently. Mia hiccuped again, her lip quivering. "I dreamed we had to leave again." Elena stiffened beside her. Lucas went still. Mia's tiny fingers clutched at the fabric of Elena's sweater. "I don't want to leave," she murmured, voice breaking. "I like it here. I like the big house and the fireplace and—" She hesitated, peeking up at him through wet lashes. "I like you." Lucas's breath caught in his chest. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Raw. Honest. A child's truth. His hands trembled as he reached out, brushing a golden curl behind her ear. "You don't have to leave, Mia," he promised. "Not ever." Mia blinked as if she wasn't sure if she could believe him. Lucas's throat burned. "I mean it," he whispered, voice hoarse. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." Mia sniffled again, studying him for a long moment. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his wrist. Lucas stopped breathing. That small, tentative touch shattered every wall he had ever built. And when Mia gave him a watery smile, he knew. He knew he would spend the rest of his life making up for the years he had lost. Making up for the nights she had cried without him there to comfort her. Making up for the birthdays he had missed, the scraped knees he hadn't kissed better, the stories he hadn't read to her at bedtime. Making up for the fact that this was the first time she had ever reached for him. He wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just the man who had been left behind. He was her father. And he wasn't letting go. Not now, not ever. If you've made it this far, you've seen just how much Lucas has lost. But more importantly, you've seen what he's finally starting to gain. A daughter, a chance, a purpose. But what happens next? Can Elena and Lucas move forward and truly co-parent? Can they put the past behind them? And more importantly, can Lucas be the father Mia needs him to be? Let me know in the comments. What advice would you give Lucas? Should he forgive Elena completely, or should she have to earn it? Like this video and subscribe if you want to see what happens next. Because trust me, the real journey is only just beginning. The days turned into weeks, and the once cold and distant mansion that Lucas Calloway called home began to change. Not in the way that houses change with time, through dust settling or the creak of wooden floors bending under footsteps, but in a way that was felt rather than seen. It was the laughter that started filling the hallways, the scent of homemade meals drifting from the kitchen, the soft pitter-patter of small feet running down the corridors. It was Mia. Mia, who had spent her first few nights at the mansion unsure, hesitant, a child caught between a world she had known and one she was learning to trust. Mia, who had clung to Elena, her mother, the only person she had ever known to be a constant in her life, watching Lucas from a distance, unsure of what to make of him. But now something was shifting. Now Mia woke up every morning with excitement in her eyes, not fear. Now she raced to the breakfast table instead of waiting for permission to take a seat. Now she looked for Lucas, and Lucas looked for her. He didn't even realize it at first. The way his day started to feel incomplete if he didn't hear Mia's voice first thing in the morning. The way he found himself coming home earlier just to spend more time with her. The way he had started to think not just as a man, but as a father. The first time Mia called him daddy, it almost knocked the breath from his lungs. It had been a normal evening. He had been sitting in the living room, flipping through the newspaper with a glass of whiskey in his hand, when Mia appeared at his side, tugging gently at his sleeve. "Daddy, can I show you something?" Lucas's heart stopped. For a second, he wasn't even sure if he had heard her right. Daddy, not Lucas, not Mr. Calloway, Daddy. The glass slipped from his fingers, the newspaper forgotten, his world narrowing to the little girl standing in front of him, looking up at him with so much innocence, so much trust. "Elena," his voice cracked as he turned toward where she was standing in the doorway, hands clasped to her mouth, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had heard it too. Mia frowned, glancing between them. Did I say it wrong? Lucas let out a choked breath, shaking his head quickly. No, God, no. You... His voice failed him for a moment, and he had to clear his throat before trying again. You called me... Daddy, Mia repeated, tilting her head, her little brows furrowing. Is it okay? Can I call you that? Lucas's entire body felt like it was shattering and rebuilding itself at the same time. Could she? Could she call him that after all the years he had missed, after all the moments he hadn't been there for? But then Mia smiled, a big, bright, innocent smile. And Lucas knew. He knew it didn't matter how much time he had lost. He had today. He had tomorrow. He had forever to be the father she deserved. So he did the only thing that felt right. He scooped her up into his arms, pressing a kiss to her curls, his voice rough with emotion. Of course you can, sweetheart. Mia giggled, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck, holding on to him like she had always belonged there, like he belonged there. And in that moment, Lucas Calloway knew he would never let her go. But not everything was easy. For every step forward, there were still shadows that lingered. Lucas and Elena had fallen into an uneasy rhythm, co-parents, partners in raising Mia, but still two people bound by a painful past. There were still things left unsaid, things left unresolved. Some nights, when Mia was asleep and the house was quiet, Lucas would find Elena sitting by the fireplace, staring at the flames as if they held all the answers she had spent years searching for. She never spoke of the sleepless nights she had spent wondering if she had made the wrong choice. She never spoke of the fear that still clung to her, the guilt that still weighed on her. And Lucas never asked. Because as much as he wanted to understand, as much as he wanted to forgive, he wasn't sure if he was ready. He wasn't sure if he could look at Elena and not think about the years he had been robbed of. But then one night, Elena broke the silence. They were sitting in the kitchen, both of them nursing cups of coffee after another long day. Elena hesitated, her fingers curled around the ceramic mug, her knuckles white from gripping too hard. I know you haven't forgiven me, she whispered. Lucas stiffened. She wasn't wrong. Elena swallowed hard, glancing down at the steam rising from her drink. I don't know if you ever will. I don't know if I even deserve it. Lucas's jaw tightened. She had hurt him. She had taken something from him that he could never get back. But then he thought about Mia. He thought about the way she smiled at him now, the way she reached for his hand, the way she had called him daddy for the first time and never looked back. If Elena hadn't done what she did, would he even be here? Would he even know Mia existed? Would he have missed out on the greatest love of his life? Lucas exhaled, setting his cup down, finally meeting Elena's eyes. I don't know if I can ever forget, he admitted, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. Elena nodded as if she had already accepted that answer before he even said it. But, he continued, his fingers tapping against the table, I don't want to live in the past anymore. Otti, Elena's breath caught. Lucas leaned back, running a hand through his hair. For Mia's sake, for all of our sakes, I want to move forward. Elena blinked rapidly as if trying to keep herself from crying. You do? Lucas hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. I do. The words weren't perfect. They weren't a full forgiveness, not yet. But they were a start. And sometimes a start was enough. The days that followed were filled with small steps forward, cautious moments of healing, and the quiet realization that something fragile yet unbreakable had begun to take shape between them. For the first time in 6 years, Lucas Calloway's mansion no longer felt empty. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, or the small giggles of Mia as she ran from room to room, her tiny feet pitter-pattering against the polished floors. It wasn't just the scent of breakfast in the mornings, the warmth of a home-cooked meal shared at a table where once there had been only silence. It was the feeling of family, the one thing Lucas had spent his whole life convincing himself he didn't need. And yet, here they were. Mia had started waiting for him at the front door when he came home from work, her arms stretched wide, her voice bright with excitement. Daddy! Mo, the first time it happened, Lucas had nearly stumbled back from the force of it. Not because she had called him Daddy, she had been doing that for days now, but because of the way she ran into his arms, with full trust, with no hesitation, as if she had been waiting her entire life to belong to him. And maybe she had. Lucas had never known how much he needed her until now, until he walked through his own front door and felt something other than exhaustion waiting for him. Love. He had spent so long chasing success, believing it would be enough, believing that if he built something big enough, strong enough, he would never have to feel the loss of what had been taken from him. But all it took was one little girl's arms around his neck, one tiny voice calling him Daddy, for everything he had ever built to feel like nothing in comparison. And Elena, she had changed too. Lucas saw it in the way she allowed herself to relax, the way she no longer carried every burden alone, the way she let him be a father without pushing him away. She still struggled. He saw it in the way her fingers tensed when she thought no one was looking, the way her breath caught whenever Mia reached for him first instead of her. Because for 6 years, Elena had been everything for Mia. Now she wasn't alone anymore. But sometimes Lucas wondered if she knew how to let go of the guilt that still lived inside her. If she knew how to forgive herself. One night he found her standing on the balcony, staring out at the city skyline, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding herself from something invisible. Lucas stepped beside her, resting his forearms against the railing. "You look like you have something on your mind," he said. Elena let out a small, humorless laugh. "I always do." He studied her for a moment, the way the night breeze lifted strands of her hair, the way her fingers trembled slightly before she clenched them into fists. "Tell me," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then finally she whispered, "I don't deserve this." Lucas frowned, turning to her fully. "What?" Elena let out a shaky breath, tears brimming in her tired eyes. "You," she said softly. "Mia getting to know you, this house, a second chance." She shook her head, voice breaking. "I don't deserve any of it." Lucas inhaled deeply, his chest tightening at the rawness in her voice. "Elena, I stole 6 years from you." She cut him off, her voice thick with emotion. "I took away time you will never get back. I made a decision that wasn't mine to make. And even now, after everything, I still wake up every morning wondering if this is all some dream, if one day you'll wake up and realize you can never truly forgive me." Lucas clenched his jaw because he knew what it was like to live with guilt. But he also knew what it was like to watch someone you love suffer under the weight of it for too long. He turned to her, stepping closer. "You think I don't wake up every morning regretting what I lost?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "You think I don't wonder what it would have been like if I had found you sooner? If I had somehow stopped you from leaving?" Elena let out a trembling breath, her shoulders shaking. "But here's the thing, Elena," Lucas continued. "Regret won't give us back the past. It won't let me hold Mia as a newborn. It won't let me kiss her goodnight on her first birthday. It won't let me teach her how to walk or hear her say my name for the first time." Elena squeezed her eyes shut. Lucas reached out, gently tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "But I do get to be there now," he said, his voice softer now, filled with something that felt an awful lot like hope. "I get to be there when she wakes up tomorrow morning. I get to see her first day of school. I get to help her when she falls, cheer for her when she succeeds." Elena let out a small sob, her lips trembling. "And you, Elena?" Lucas whispered, his thumb brushing away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "You get to stop punishing yourself. You get to let go of the past and actually live in what we have right now. Because this," he gestured between them toward the house filled with laughter and second chances. "This is real." Elena let out a breath she had been holding for years. Lucas watched her, waiting, letting her take her time, and then finally she nodded. a small shaky nod. But it was enough. Lucas exhaled, stepping back, giving her space. "Come inside," he said, "where it's getting cold." Elena hesitated for only a second, then for the first time, she let herself follow. The weight of the past had been heavy, but as the days stretched into weeks and weeks, turned into months, something remarkable happened. Lucas, Elena, and Mia found something they never thought possible. Healing. It didn't come all at once. It didn't erase the pain, nor did it undo the lost time, but it came in small, everyday moments. It came in the sound of Mia's laughter echoing through the halls of Lucas's once empty mansion, in the way her tiny feet would race down the hall every morning, eager to find him. It came in the way Elena's shoulders finally relaxed, the way she no longer flinched every time she looked at him, fearing that one day he would wake up and decide she didn't deserve forgiveness. It came in the way Lucas found himself coming home earlier, staying longer, prioritizing bedtime stories over late-night meetings, and choosing to be present rather than just successful, because he finally understood what success really meant. It wasn't about power or money or the empire he had built. It was this: a daughter who looked at him like he hung the moon. A woman who, despite the mistakes, had given him something far more valuable than wealth, a family. For a long time, Lucas didn't know what the future held for them. Would he and Elena ever find their way back to love? Did love even matter, as long as they were giving Mia the family she deserved? He didn't have all the answers. But one night, as they sat on the back porch, watching Mia chase fireflies in the yard, he realized he didn't need them. The past would always be there, but so would the future. And he finally had one worth fighting for. Lucas turned to Elena, watching her watch Mia, the glow of the fireflies reflecting in her eyes. She looked at peace. For the first time, she looked like she had finally stopped running. "Elena," he said softly. She turned to him, her lips parting slightly in surprise at the softness in his voice. He hesitated, then reached for her hand, his fingers wrapping gently around hers. "I don't know what this means," he admitted, gesturing between them. "I don't know if we'll ever be the way we were before." Elena swallowed hard. "I don't either." Lucas exhaled, his thumb brushing against the back of her hand, steady, sure. "But I know this," he continued. "I'm not letting go. Not of you, not of Mia, not of this family." Elena's breath hitched. The past had tried to break them, but the future was still theirs to build. She squeezed his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me neither." Lucas smiled. And just like that, it was enough. Life doesn't always give us second chances. Sometimes people leave, time is lost, and mistakes can't be undone. But when life does give us a second chance, we have a choice. We can let guilt, pride, or fear stop us from reaching for it, or we can choose to fight. Fight for love, fight for family, fight for the people who matter. Because at the end of the day, money, success, and pride mean nothing if you have no one to share them with. Lucas learned that lesson. Elena learned to forgive herself. And Mia, she finally got the family she had always deserved. So if you've ever made a mistake, if you've ever lost something or someone and wondered if there's still a way back, remember this story. Because sometimes the best things in life come from the people we never expected to see again, from the bridges we thought we had burned, from the moments we never thought we'd get back. And when those moments come, don't let them go. If you've made it this far, you've been part of Lucas, Elena, and Mia's journey, a journey of pain, regret, but most importantly, redemption. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Lucas's shoes? Do you think he and Elena should try to rekindle their love, or is co-parenting enough? What's the biggest lesson you took from this story? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, if you felt the emotions, the struggles, the hope, then please take a second to like this video. Your support helps keep these stories alive. And if you want more stories of love, loss, hope, and second chances, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another one. Because trust me, the next story, it's going to be even more unforgettable. Until next time, keep believing in second chances.